Yeah, I guess Michael is really the reason why I'm here, and probably the reason why all the rest of you are here, if not directly, certainly indirectly. And Michael may well say that the reason he's here is due to somebody called Klaus Riegel, who he'll be saying some more about. But I guess my association with Michael started in 2016 in The Hague when Michael presented at the ESRAD conference there. But of course, I knew of his work originally because I've studied under Basseches. But it was, I think, 2018 when we finally kind of started conversations about Michael's model of dialectic and what I'll call the Russian or Nikolai Varax's model of dialectic. And that actually spurred a series of meetings. Oh no, 2017, we went to Moscow, and the Russians were interested in translating Michael's book into Russian. And that was followed by ISRAD meeting in 2018, and then another meeting in Moscow in 2019, where we finally started talking about the Routledge International, what's become the Routledge International Handbook of Dialectical Thinking. So Michael was very much the inspiration for that effort. And I promised you, I think back in March, that we'd have some sessions where we talk about various chapters of the book. And so it's with great pleasure that Michael has agreed to tell us about his chapter, which is really one of the core chapters in the book today. I think without further ado, I should hand over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you for reviewing our whole association, which has been a pleasure. Yeah, I think Nick tells me that many of you are familiar with the work in my 1984 book, so that I thought I'd today on what I've learned since the 2016 meeting and these annual meetings, learning about the research going on in Russia, um, trying to understand its relationship to what I had studied. And I really, Klaus Riegel, it very much, well, I decided I want to dedicate this discussion to the memory of Klaus Riegel. Um, he he was a German immigrant to the United States who I figured out over the period of watching him work so ferociously that he had a terminal illness. And so he was trying to um, develop a model of a dialectical psychology, which is a pretty big, all consuming task in a small amount of years. And he worked with tremendous energy. But he did provide a framework that really turned out to be tremendously useful when I was trying to take in all I was learning during the last 8 years and put them in relationship to the work I had done. So I'm going to dedicate this meeting to him. Think the handbook is done, soon to be out. We're in a position to engage in a kind of longitudinal research that would have really filled out the vision that Klaus sketched out. And so it's a good moment to be talking about him. And I'd like to talk with all of you about what you see as the possibilities for longitudinal research, as well as hearing more about the kinds of research the Center for Applied Dialectics has been interested in and how they go together. I'm going to say a little bit about the difference that Klaus made in my life. And then I'm going to put up a slide that's a figure that I created for the book with the help of Mike Moskalo, but was very much based on the framework. It's a many times revised figure based on the one that Klaus published in 1973. I guess what you should know about me when I met Klaus. During my undergraduate years, I was a joint philosophy and psychology major. And there were two aspects of my focus of my study. One was immersing myself in the work of Jean Piaget, who, um, having an introductory knowledge of psychology, I found him the most interesting psychologist. And I would have told you back in the late 60s, early 70s, that he was my favorite psychologist. So I really concentrated on understanding what Piaget had done as best I could. And then meanwhile, there was my philosophy courses and the whole remainder of the liberal arts education that was required at Swarthmore College, where I was. And I would say during that strand of my education, I kept noticing these family resemblances between different approaches to theory and inquiry across all of the scientific, social scientific, humanistic disciplines. And I kind of, for most of the time I was Swarthmore, I could see these resemblances, but I didn't really have a word for it. But by the end of my senior year, I had read Kant and I had done my best to read Hegel, and I understood the relationship between their two philosophies. And I understood the word dialectical analysis that Hegel and Hegel scholars referred to, and that was a good way of kind of conceptualizing what my favorite of these families had in common. There was some, there was some, and I think that was the idea, that there was an implicit model of dialectic behind the work of a lot of different theorists. So, with that in mind, I started applying to graduate schools, PhD programs in 1972. And what I was proposing was that I hoped to do for Hegel's dialectical thinking what Piaget had done for Kant's idea of a priori knowledge, which was to study the developmental psychological processes by which these cognitive capacities developed. So I was accepted in a program in personality and developmental psychology in Harvard's Department of Psychology and Social Relations. So at least someone thought this wasn't just a totally crazy, ambitious idea. And that was gratifying. But when I got to Harvard and had this challenge in front of me, I felt very, very much alone. Larry Kohlberg was the one faculty member who certainly understood Piaget better than I did and was mildly curious about what I wanted to do. But then it wasn't until after a year there that I discovered Klaus Riegel's article, which was called Dialectic Operations, the Final Period in Cognitive Development. And reading that gave me a start. I felt, oh, okay, I have a starting point. I have something to build on. And the other thing, when I reached out to introduce myself to him, he invited me to a meeting of what was called the Dialectical Psychology Network. And I remember being tremendously buoyed by the existence of this network. And by the end of this conference, I felt like, well, if I manage to go ahead and do this work, there are at least 100 people in the world who will be interested enough to read it. So I'm not just doing this as a, way of exercising my mind for half a decade, but that there is an audience. Okay, so this is what we'll be doing for my part of the talking today, is kind of talking our way through this screen. Let me first say a couple of things about Riegel's assumptions. One, Riegel saw cognitive development as naturally a dialectical process. And he felt Piaget's descriptions of the first 2 years of life, which were mainly based on his own 3 kids and were like they had almost daily entries about what changed from day to day, makes it very clear the nature of the dialectical process that Riegel thought, as many as Hegel did, was essential to thought itself. However, following on Marx's concept of alienated labor in contrast to natural human labor, Riegel asserted that alienated thinking was also common in capitalist society due to the way the institutions of education and socialization operated, which were, of course, designed to prepare developing individuals for their roles in capitalist society. So overall, Riegel cast Piaget's corpus of work in the 1950s as describing the process of alienation of human thought. I can say more about that after I talk about the top line and the right vertical line. So along the top line were listed Piaget's, what I would call the various structures of stability that provided order and stability to thought that Piaget saw from the organization of sensory motor intelligence, which basically consisted of having a complex map of how to get from any place to any place, or how to put together any series of actions to accomplish a result, even if the pathway was cut off. I think you're all familiar with Piaget's other stage structures. And Riegel hypothesized that there was another structure called dialectical operations that was yet to be described. He also, in the right-hand column, he described what would be the development of natural thought, a sensory motor dialectical intelligence, pre-operational dialectical operations, concrete dialectical operations, and formal dialectical operations. So there was something in that upper right-hand corner that somehow put the two together, that put all of the Piagetian competencies that are listed along the top, along with some set of dialectical competencies. And maybe the way of thinking about this is if what the Piagetian competencies did was allow human beings to create order. So if they're competencies for creating order, both in one's thinking and one's understanding of the world. Riegel proposed complementary mental processes for maintaining that natural dialectical character of thinking while making use of the structures, the more and more complex structures for creating and maintaining order that are in the top line. He stated at the time, which was interesting, that these phenomena across the right-hand column had only begun to be researched by a few Soviet psychologists. He mentioned Vygotsky, of course, he mentioned Rubinstein, but since meeting Nikolai Vareksa, I've assumed that he is one of the descendants of that line of research that Riegel was talking about when he said, hey, they've started to study this in the Soviet Union.
Am I right in thinking that what this chart does is it compares the path that various different researchers have conceptualized the combination of dialectical thinking and Piagetian thinking stages. And against that, it has three individual pathways, which are in light gray, which are
Right,
hypothesized pathways that individuals might take throughout their lifespan.
exactly,
And so,
exactly. So, in
and
other words, how the course of any developing individual's life and the ways in which they have an opportunity to develop their dialectical capacities as well as their order creating and preserving capacities could be very, very different for different individuals. And I think my main point today is that if we're really going to understand the development of dialectical thinking, we need to start studying some of these individuals to see which ones in preschool are doing more dialectical thinking and which are less, and what happens over the course of education, higher education, career development that would create, you could say more neutrally, a bias towards one or the other type of thinking. I mean, with Piaget, he spent different parts of his life focusing on different styles of thinking, and that's why, especially USicans have a very difficult had a very difficult time, maybe still do, in understanding Piaget's work, because he had a basic dialectical model that comes out very clearly when he's describing development from birth to age 2. And then, again, in my view, because he was interested in what Kant called a priori knowledge, and he was kind of creating an antithesis to Kant. He was saying, okay, Emmanuel, you say that certain aspects of thought are just the way they are because this is how our minds are structured. They're inherent to all human thinking, and human beings couldn't think in any other way. And he was referring to things like categories of time and space and some of the other basic principles of a priori knowledge. And Piaget was saying these things actually develop over time. Babies don't come into the world able to, with a continuous sense of time, with ideas like conservation of volume, conservation of mass. These are things that develop. So so that's why Piaget did his work along the top line there, trying to understand the more and more sophisticated structures. And then when he got to formal operations and people said to him, "What's next?" he saw a lot less universality in structures of thought, much more variety. And he started writing more about dialectics in the 70s at the same time that Riegel was doing this work and I was going to graduate school. Um, he started writing about studies in contradiction, um, basically the whole question of what happens after formal operations and how you have to understand the further development of adults' thought, which is much more idiosyncratic and less universal. So yes, what my figure here depicts is both what Riegel imagined was ideal development, which he claimed you didn't see as much as you should have, in part because psychologists weren't looking for it. Said as a psychologist, you can only find what you're looking for. And especially US psychologists were not looking for this. And also, Riegel said, because the structures in education, they teach kids that it's great to have right answers, that most questions have one right answer and a whole bunch of wrong answers. And it's really that the way one becomes smart is to accumulate right answers and grow one's ability to figure out the right answers. So that's the alienation that he was talking about, that the right answers assumed a stable universe where things didn't change. In my work, I describe it as a closed system of lawful relationships. The model of formal operations that the formal operation analyst imposes on the world is looking for a closed system of lawful relationships. Whereas dialectical thinkers are looking at change processes, are looking at developmental processes, are looking at things that change, sometimes in patterns, sometimes in unpatterned ways. Okay, so Riegel is saying, when he says idealized path, he means both. This is what psychologists would see if they developed the tools to observe dialectical operations at all ages. And this is what psychologists would see more of if the power structures in the world didn't depend on people thinking that everything was lawful. And therefore, to have one's place, one had to, get on board with let's find the laws. Let's find the laws, let's articulate the laws, and we'll understand how the universe works. Now that I've done what I did, which was basically, I saw the sensory motor dialectical intelligence in the work in the first 2 years. It was clear Piaget was clearly one of the dialectical family of thinkers. He, John Dewey, Marx, Kuhn, there were a variety of other people who I studied in different disciplines where there was this same implicit thing in the background of there always being the possibility for change, and really, and change coming from a multiplicity of right answers or a multiplicity of theories. You could always bring several different ones together to come up with something more adequate for the moment. And then as the world would change, you would need to, just like babies assimilate the new events, you'd have to assimilate the experience and accommodate your own way of making sense to the new data or the new experience. So, I'm saying that with the tools that okay, I'm sorry, I'm losing my track. But so going back to, I saw the sensory motor dialectical intelligence that Piaget had described. I saw that from there, he started looking for these structures of stability. And so I'm the line of dashes that immediately heads over to the upper left-hand corner and follows Piaget's sequence. And then you get to formal operations, and it still doesn't solve all of the problems. I mean, when you get to the upper right-hand corner, I say, whoa, I tried to describe what a dialectical organization of thinking was and how to recognize it. Because again, Klaus Riegel said, if psychologists don't have tools for seeing it, they're not going to find it. So a lot of my dissertation work was based on how do you recognize dialectical thinking when you see it? And the 24 dialectical schemata that I came up with were basically my tools for observing dialectical thinking. And then my theoretical concept was embodied in my definition of dialectic, which I'll read that in a few moments when you're ready for it. But it basically, just like the closed system of lawful relationships, is a kind of internalized model of how the universe works that can be applied to understanding different phenomena. So say a formal operational thinker uses his closed system or her closed system thinking tools to map the world. And I would say a dialectical thinker uses this implicit model of dialectic to map the world. So, and then we'll talk a bit about what I did up there in the right-hand corner, and then how it made possible seeing a lot more phenomena in earlier development. And the Russians kind of helped me go down that the vertical line on the right-hand side, took me back to preschool as it was, showed me what preschoolers did that was dialectical. And so that's what I understand now. And then there's the Russian pathway. I can't. Yeah, the path explored by Russian research, which I think pays a lot focus on. Well, I'll get to Russian stuff in a moment. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by dialectic contrast between approaching the world and making sense of phenomena in the world using a dialectical model or a model of the closed system of lawful relationships. And I won't talk about the dialectical schemata. One, Nick tells me most of you are familiar with them, and two, they're all connected to the idea of dialectical thinking, but they're the things one's most likely to observe in an interview. This is me following Piaget. Like I said, I spent, when I wasn't noticing these family resemblance across all the disciplines, I was studying Piaget's work really carefully. And I was following him, and I saw how, he used this wonderful dialectical model to describe day by day the development of sensory motor intelligence. And then after that, he went on to describe the various structures for maintaining stability. that are across the top. So I followed him right up to where he left off and moved from sensory motor intelligence, pre-operations, complete formal operations, and eventually to the question of dialectical thinking, which I saw as a post-formal operational um, structure. And like the Piagetian structures, well, the way I would say it's post-formal is if post-formal involves the ability to systematize, then dialectical thinking builds on that ability to systematize, builds on formal operational ability to create very complex systems of lawful relationships, enables thinkers, scientists, adults solving their life problems to use those structures, but also to transcend them, to begin to talk about systems in relation to other systems. And when tensions develop in those relationships among systems, how it takes dialectical thinking to understand what's happening in the tensions.
Michael, I'm just thinking about your view that what helps, yeah, Michael, just thinking about your view that what what causes or what kind of facilitates people's dialectical thinking is their understanding that the current way of thinking, the formal operations, is somehow inadequate to answer the kind of problems that they have to
Yes,
solve.
yes,
But now, if we think about Regal's view and the Russian work, it's as if this capability for dialectical thinking was there all the way along.
yes, yes. And
And
it was either cultivated or left uncultivated. I mean, I can, we can ask if Igor agrees with that characterization, but as the Russian line, very intensely studying sensory motor dialectical. Well, Piaget already did that. We both were nearby each other in that lower right hand corner, the Russians and I. But at that point, kind of, I swallowed Piaget whole and said, what are the problems that, what are we missing? And I started with, we're missing post-formal dialectical thinking, which is a kind of thinking that can use this systematizing ability, where, again, I invite Igor to correct me, but it seems like the Russians accepted the Piaget developments, but also felt that at each age and stage, there could be a continuation of dialectical capacities if teachers put their mind. I suppose parents also play a big role and other socialization agents, but if psychologists put enough attention into noticing it and studying it, you could see continuing development of what Riegel called the natural dialectical nature of thought. Maybe maybe I will skip ahead to the Russians.
Yeah, I just
yeah,
can make one note here,
Yes,
Michael,
yes,
if you're fine with that.
yes,
So for me, it's important to to uh, um, pay attention to the point that there are like two different things. If we are looking for description of child's mind, like Piaget does for sensomotor intelligence, as you mentioned before, and from another side, and we are just describe this process of mental development, of cognitive development, as the dialectical one, as the like following dialectical structure. And the other point is about using dialectical operation by children themselves. And
Yes.
that's important thing that which was for us and for Nikolai and all the team which was working with him, just to show not only how the thinking process is dialectical itself, but how children can apply those dialectical rules, dialectical schematas, consciously or unconsciously. But they are doing that and we just found that it
They're
happens
doing
with
that. I'm sorry, they're doing that.
they're doing that consciously or unconsciously. So yeah, I mean, so they
Mhm,
just
mhm.
naturally.
Yes,
And
yes.
like what we discovered that some kids are able to do that. We don't know where it comes from. Either it comes from the parents, the teachers, or from just operating with materials, whatever, like doing experimentation and etc. As Piaget would say. So, but for me, it's important to divide those two application of dialectics. Like either we use dialectics to understand the cognitive processes, and this is the one point. And another point
Yes.
is when we study how children use adults use the dialectics themselves, and sometimes it's a challenge because when we start
Oops.
explaining and understanding what is behind, especially children's words, sometimes we just put in too much into the word. But it's another topic. But anyway, that's important to say that um, we studied how children use dialectical structures themselves, and that's the point.
Yeah, so putting that together with what Nick said, you could say one aspect of what Igor is talking about is what the children do to kind of preserve their freedom and creativity as they've learned more of these socially shared tools and orderings. And that you could conceivably study just the way Piaget studied um, the babies, the kids until they were 2. And it has to do with problem solving. I mean, the kids, they may play problems are not that different from work problems from the point of view of the thinker. There's a there's a task that you either set for yourself or someone else challenges you to do. And if the structures you've um, created are inadequate, you have to create something new on the spot. So that's one side of the research. The reason for that arrow going down is because to do the second thing, which is as psychologists understand this moving back and forth between the need to create order and the need to escape the limitations of any given ordering, that takes the kind of post-formal dialectical thinking. So that I think having the model of post-formal dialectical thinking helps with the second, more scientific aspect that Igor was talking about of going up and down that right hand line. But let me just what I learned. Nikolai gave a talk a couple of weeks ago for the other chapter authors, where what I understood him to say is the basic dialectical operation is that it's, and Igor again can correct, that the fundamental dialectical operation is the attention to opposites, the looking at something that's the opposite of something else. He gave the example of night as the opposite of day, above as the opposite of below, left as the opposite of right. One, if you have 22 players on the field playing a game that could either be American football or the rest of the world's football, understanding that within the structure of the game, there's team one and team two. And it isn't just random movement. The team one has a contrary goal to team two. So that at the point that a kid becomes able to say, this is the opposite of that, and at the same time, they're saying X is the opposite of Y, they are articulating in some way the relationship. Well, how does it work with day and night? Well, it stays day until the sun goes down, and then it's night, and then when the sun comes back up, it's day. That's a pretty thorough dialectical analysis of that involves what I call a differentiation and integration. What's day, what's night, what's the relationship between the two of them. So from the time kids start doing that, they're doing dialectical thinking. And Nikolai described a set of other relationships within any given pair that he also called dialectical operations. And then he described a movement. The minute you move from one pair, like east and west, to another pair, like north and south, and ask how are they related, you are creating a more complex dialectical structure. And so dialectical structures increase with age in their complexity. Now, how Piaget's stages correspond to, what Nikolai notated as D1, D2, D3, D4, maybe some of our colleagues who do hierarchical complexity could help in lining those things up. But the point is that they are studying this process as it becomes more complex, with the development of more stability in their psychological worlds and in their understanding of the worlds around them. So that's what I was going to say about the Russian approach. I'll take a few more minutes to give you my definition of dialectic, and then to give you an example. And so you'll see what it means to compare dialectical thinking as a post-formal organization with formal thinking. And then we can figure out how to go about studying those individual pathways to really understand at an individual level in relation to a social level whether we get the development of dialectical thinkers or not. Okay, so my definition of dialectical thinking, and I thought I'd put this down, but I'm not sure. It starts with, what is a dialectic? A dialectic is developmental transformation, or a developmental movement through forms. Transformation is movement through forms, which occurs as a result of constitutive and interactive relationships. The constitutive relationships mean that the relationship makes the parties to the relationship what they are. So were these 22 people not playing a game of football with rules, they would not be in this competitive relationship. They could do anything else on the field, but it's the relationship that requires teams and makes them a team. And then interactive means the parties interact. What one party to the relationship does is constantly affecting the other party. So it's this entire movement, which my example will illustrate, from one form to another. And that's as opposed to movements in forms.
Michael, the one term you haven't explained there is developmental.
Development.
What is the significance of development?
that it's a movement towards greater complexity and adequacy, whether it's epistemic adequacy, but also problem-solving adequacy. So I think of that as the movement toward the building of structures with greater complexity as something that's constantly going on, and as the example will illustrate. Yes, so as the dialectical operations develop at the concrete operations stage, it becomes, there's a greater synthesis. That movement to the left is kind of like a synthesis between Piagetian capacities that are mastered and dialectical capacities that are mastered. So each time you develop more, you can think of it this way: each time you develop more complex rule structures for maintaining order, you need to go back I'm most familiar with it at the formal level, but once you understand that a particular scientific paradigm, the science is organized by paradigms, and you can go through long periods of history where one paradigm is dominant in a particular scientific field. You become interested in what are the alternatives. It also, the way Kuhn describes it, there start being the paradigm is maintained by a bunch of ad hoc hypotheses that make scientists uncomfortable. So they need to go back to start a revolution, to while recognizing the power of what we've learned from the whole history of physics, to understand that classical physics was limited, and that if we try to extend it too far, the particles that are too small, going too fast, we need other conceptual frameworks like quantum physics. So the going back is the going back to what was sort of already agreed on, and discovering a new going back with tools to be able to use concrete or formal operations, but not in such a restrictive way. So I would imagine, and again, Igor teaches at a university that teaches teachers, how you would teach teachers at each stage to go back and forth between the capacity. It's not that the child regresses in his or her development. It's that the child brings together this sort of interest in change, even if it's seen as magical transformation, interest in what can happen that's unusual, that doesn't fit with the rules I've learned. What happens if I behave not in accordance with the rules? How will that play itself out? And if you simply get the same old punishment, in parent training, they say be consistent about the punishments. If you want a kid to learn the rules, have the same exact boring punishment each time the kid disobeys the rules, and the kid will learn them well. But when I was in Portugal last time, there was a table where the mother and the father were not treating the kids' rules infraction at all a similar way. The father was much more kind of playfully willing to join in, and the mother played at being strict. She said, no, you have to stay in your chair. Don't get up from your chair. But there was this glimmer in her eye where I could tell at the next table she was role playing. Sometimes he would get a kiss and a hug out of the whole experience. Sometimes he wouldn't. But that exploring the uncertainty part, once one's developed the dialectical capacity to do that, one can go back and forth using different ordering structures. That's what I was trying to, I think, reflect. I was trying to say all this in words, and Mike Musclo kept trying to draw it. So we may not have perfectly understood each other at each point, but that in itself, maybe you brought up an interesting contradiction.
I think one aspect that was helpful that you mentioned that when this line goes back, on the one hand, the line that Thomas spoke about, the Russian line going back to the left, but maybe also your line, the zigzag line that goes down from the right top to the right bottom corner, that it would, I think, be a misunderstanding to see this as a regression, as you mentioned.
Exactly. In fact, yes, that's a great example. It's the ability to take new, if you think of it as developing new capacities and then revisiting old problems or seeing those problems in a new way as a result of the new capacities. That it's not when we get to the point of even when we chart these individual pathways, they're a little bit less wiggly. They more or less, but I do expect individuals to either to get stuck either on their left to right movement or bottom to top movement. All right, so yes. There's that definition of dialectic. And so again, with that definition of dialectical thinking is application of the model of dialectic to some aspect of the world. Just like formal thinking is the application of a model of closed system of lawful relationships. Okay, so I talked about so movement through forms versus movement within forms. Pupfish is a species that I don't know a lot about, but this is all what I'm told. When there is ample territory for nesting in which space, habitat, and substrata conditions are good, reproductive activity can be seen as organized by a dominance hierarchy. Thus, the activities of individual fish can be understood as movement within the form of the dominance hierarchy. As a reproductive season approaches, the mature males who develop a bright blue color engage in activities that establish their places in a dominance hierarchy. Then, in order of the hierarchy from top to bottom, each male chooses a territory which he tries to make as attractive as possible to welcome female pupfish to lay eggs. The females, who have a much more neutral color, in an order mainly organized by size, they explore the male's territory and territories and choose in which territory to lay the eggs. They could lay them in several territories. Males fertilize the eggs that are in the territories where they are then protected until the fish are born. So that is the typical, normal, the closed system pattern you would identify for normal or undeveloped pupfish reproduction. In contrast, a movement through forms or a dialectic occurs when, due to some combination of the activity of the pupfish and other influences on their environment, seen dialectically as constitute interaction relationships, which I'll get to later, but as a result of their activity and the environmental activity, a scarcity, of territory suitable for nesting arises. This leads to the emergence of a more differentiated form of social organization, in which males divide into three types, differentiated by both reproductive strategy and appearance. The larger males become highly territorial, trying to create and defend their territories, while the smaller males become either satellites or sneak spawners. The satellites are smaller in size than the males with territories, but have similar phenotypical appearances. They function as parasites on the territories, and they reproduce by disrupting and stalling copulation by the territorial males, and they manage to fertilize a few eggs themselves as they're passing through, as it were. In contrast, the sneak spawners become more like females, both behaviorally and in their phenotypical experience, remaining closer to females in size and not having a blue color. To other males, they appear to be females passing through territories while deciding where to lay eggs. But at the same time, they take advantage of the opportunity to fertilize the eggs of the true females who laid them. Thus, the movement from a form of organization based on one, sexual dimorphism, similar reproductive strategies among males, and dominance hierarchies, to one based on multimorphisms, where there are many more variations in how the fish appear, differences among males' reproductive strategies, and territoriality only among larger males is seen as a movement through forms, or a dialectical movement. It's a dialectical movement through forms. To refer to this transformation as developmental implies that there's a direction to it, a direction associated with greater complexity and increased species capacity for adaptation. That's the answer to Nick's question. The definition of dialectic says that the transformation occurs via constitutive and interactive relationships. The adjective constitutive means that the relationships play a role in making the parties what they are. The adjective interactive implies that the relationship is not static, but characterized by the motion or action of the parties on each other. We can use the same example to illustrate these concepts. Constitutive and interactive relationships can be identified among the individual pupfish and between the group of pupfish and their environment. An individual pupfish's activity is organized or constituted by its relationship with other pupfish, as it's clear when we say the pupfish acts in accordance with the role in the dominance hierarchy. That means if we're describing this particular pupfish, an important descriptor is where he fits into the dominance hierarchy. And that presumes that the dominance hierarchy is actually constituting that pupfish's identity. Role of dominance hierarchy is not a characteristic of the pupfish as a separate entity, but of the pupfish's relationship to other pupfish. When we characterize an environment as providing ample territory or an adequate substrata for reproduction of all the pupfish in it, we are not describing the environment in terms that frame it as prior to or separate from its relationship with pupfish, but rather in terms that depend on or constitute its relationship with pupfish. So this just popped into my mind. If you're a travel agent trying to interest people in traveling to different, or even moving to different environments, you say, yeah, it's a good, it's an adaptive environment for humans, not so great for fish, not to, whatever. You describe the environment in terms of what kind of ecosystem it supports, not just its physical characteristics. The relationships among the pupfish and between the pupfish and their environment are interactive as well as constitutive, in that the behavior of other pupfish affect the reproductive approach, activity, and relative success for any given pupfish. Also, it's the activity of pupfish, such as creating overpopulation, that can make a formerly adequate reproductive environment no longer adequate, while changes in the environment brought about by other factors than pupfish's activity, like global warming, can also render the environment no longer adequate, leading to the transformation of the social organization of the pupfish. So to summarize how the whole process provides an illustration of dialectic, the interaction within the constitutive relationships of pupfish and their environment generate a limitation to the viability of the earlier form of reproductive activity, which in turn results in a developmental transformation or movement through forms to a new, more complex form of reproductive activity. Thus, the entire process described previously can be seen as an example of dialectic. But going back to the point, it's the existence of dialectical thinkers who are capable of dialectical analysis, who, unless they study the pupfish with this modeling capacity, will not end up describing it in this way. My question for all of you is, can you envision the kind of, would you agree that the Regal's framework 50 years later, and you have to read all the chapters of the handbook once it's published to really judge this, but that we are now in a position to carry out the kind of research that I think Regal envisioned, but he knew he would never achieve in his lifetime, of studying individuals' paths for dialect to the development of dialectical thinking, or in the development of dialectical thinking. And for practitioners, that implies being able to see how they can best intervene at any point in an individual's development to support that individual's development.
Yeah, Michael, I was going to ask you if you had any thoughts about how this conception of the development of dialectical thinking throughout the lifespan, not just in adulthood, really carries an implication for us practitioners, who I think most of us are kind of engaged in trying to help other people become more dialectical in their thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have to go back in time and really try to understand how our clients have developed their thinking, the influences on them, what they were like as children?
It's complex. First, you don't have to. You're already doing it with the tools that you have available. I said this to Nick in a private conversation, that when people ask me, why do some individuals become dialectical thinkers and others don't, I've only been able to refer to two things that, anecdotal observations. One is, people who tend to become dialectical thinkers have been exposed to role models of dialectical thinkers. If you don't have a role model, you can hit all the challenges that the world throws up that need dialectical thinking to solve, and not created out of your own mind, as it were. The other factor is that I've said, written in other places, that to become a dialectical thinker, entails trading off stability in the world and stability in one's own sense of identity for greater possibilities, for greater potential solutions to problems. And how many people, to what extent are people willing to make that trade-off? Yes, I'm willing to live in doubt about who I am, what the world is like for a while I begin to understand change more dialectically. So I think people who've had traumatic experiences at times in their lives when they've taken a leap are likely to be more conservative about that. And people for whom it's gone just swimmingly when they leap into the unknown and end up with something wonderful, are more likely to be able to make this trade-off. Now, I think knowing someone's developmental history might very much come to understand where the blockages are. What's at stake for you? What happened to you when you stood out from the crowd and asserted something different? So I think it can be helpful, like in an intense coaching relationship. If Bob Keegan would put this in terms of getting a client to question a big assumption. And what he's written is, you encourage clients to take little steps in trying to question, their assumptions so that their identities and their companies won't completely fall apart if it turns out their assumption was correct to begin with. But I think this, when I was saying for practitioners, I was also including teachers, therapists who might encounter that child at any of the stages to be better informed about how to work with particular conflicts. But I don't think I think it's more from a research point of view to understand. I think it could give us hope if we see people who have not been dialectical thinkers or have had their dialectical thinking alienated, as Riegel might say, and put in the right situation with the right support, can do better. That was my hope behind it. Okay. Piaget, I think one of the critiques that psychoanalysis could have of Piaget makes it seem like when you move from stage to stage, everything from the previous stage is preserved. And you can still do everything you were able to do, but it becomes integrated into that new structure. And I think when you go beyond creating stability in the world, but move to creative problem solving with very difficult but very important problems in the world, we've lost. It's like if you create a new filing system, it may be a much better filing system in many ways, but some particular things might get lost. You might not remember where to find them. So, but if you buy Piaget's model, you don't lose you're using these capacities. Any adult is using his sensory motor intelligence, his pre-operational intelligence, their concrete operational intelligence, their formal operational intelligence, is using it all at the same time. And the earlier stages just become integrated. So it's not you wouldn't call it going back. But let me go back to Igor's point in trying to make sense of the chart. If you look at it from the point of view of the scientist who's studying dialectical thinking, having this fuller vision enables you to study any area of the chart you choose to focus on. So that's one way to use the chart. But another way is in following the development of an individual, which I think is going to be very, very varied. And I think you can make certain conclusions from cross-sectional studies, but I don't think when it comes to development, there's anything like a longitudinal study and being able to show the different pathways individuals' lives take them in their lifespan development. I mean, we could all as a group tell our life stories and talk about more dialectical and less dialectical times in our lives and learn a lot about how different the pathways just among us we take. So using the chart to trace an individual's pathway is looking at when they developed what order creating tools and when they developed what order transcending tools. Although I don't know. Again, I'd ask Igor, if you're talking about toddlers, they're not using their dialectical operations to in some way are they resisting conformity? Are they resisting rules and laws? Or are they just, is dealing with change just as important as dealing with stabilities?
Yeah, I think it's like the second one is more possible and more regularly happen. So, but it also anyway we can't ignore it because it's the basic thing, basic point when they start more or less successfully managing this developmental stuff and the idea of opposition, opposition. So it's like the very basic point, but when child does not have an experience to do that and does not have support, so it's possibly block the further development of the electrical thinking. So that's an important, it's very, very, very basic stuff, but it's an important start point.
If you see that it's serving two very different purposes at the same time, one is corresponding to ways the individual can move in his or her development, and also areas of cognitive capacity development that we could choose to research, or as practitioners that could become our expertise at where we intervene. And like those of you who are doing executive coaching, does it make a big difference whether the executive does have the capacity for formal operations well developed, or large time focuses at a more concrete stage? I would imagine, one could make that one's expertise. So one can choose. It creates a territory that individuals in their development move through, that scientists who want to study the big picture can organize, and that practitioners who want to develop a particular area of expertise. Like if you're going to teach kindergarten and first grade, there is a lot, about the transition to concrete operations that is complicated if your goal isn't to get all the students to think the same way. So I think it's also relevant to practitioners in defining their focus of expertise.
At least for me, it's intriguing to see that you can cross these two lines, and that you can now come up with maybe up to 16 different cells. And what would it mean if you are on pre-operation dialectical operations and concrete operations? So what's the content of this cell? And still, this is a very linear thinking. that I'm describing now. And then we're coming to a journey. And if you go on a journey, does it mean that you are only there, or do you cover a territory and you're kind of the whole map your territory then later, etc., etc. But this is just the beginning of my understanding. Igor, please.
Yeah, just one remark. So for me, it's yeah. First, I find it helpful, Michael, and thank you for that. But what I would like to stress here, that this idea of post-formal is the kind of trap for us, because it's like when you use this concept, it means like it's like above or beyond formal operation, or and after formal operation, and it doesn't go this way. And you try, as I see, you just try to catch this point there. So it's like we have this, and as our studies showed, and our understanding of dialectical thinking development from early childhood till adolescence, that's it goes simultaneously, and it's important to like in these terms, like formal and post-formal grows together, not just one after another. And that's an important point. And I think that you try to catch this very point, that it goes simultaneously, not just one after another. And from my perspective, it's the dialectics of this process that the child and later adult just manage both in the same time, both in the simultaneously stability and development. And that is really impressive dialectical stuff that all of us more or less successful again solving while developing our mind. And so that's an important point, and important that you were trying to catch it in your commentary.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. That it's that ideally, if you had a society that thought change and transformation were equally important to regularities, and that was the kind of zeitgeist of the culture, that one might expect all of these developments to be occurring simultaneously. And it may be a product of our educational systems, our political systems, our economic systems, that at all levels we're more interested in functioning within the regularities that we find ourselves noticing. But would you agree that you have to be able to understand a system in order to analyze how systems interact with each other and create the possibility of transforming into more integrated systems when they interact? That's the other sense in which it's post-formal. It logically depends on this capacity for systematization. But yes, I think, because individuals may think very formalistically about some areas of their lives, and more dialectically about other areas of their lives. In any given individual, you have two modes that are kind of both trying to spread and conflicting at their borders. But that once someone is able to master systematic analysis, they're able to do a different kind of dialectical thinking from someone who is limited to concrete operational ways of creating order.
There is a part of me that would like to continue this conversation, but we're now, I think, 100 minutes past the beginning. So for me, at least, it was fascinating to see how maybe something similar happened that Ken Wilber did when he stopped putting the states above his stages. So before he created the Wilber-Combs lattice. And so I think the similar happened here when we have the dialectical development, not on top of formal operations, but kind of crossing it. So for me, this at least was very helpful. Michael, is there a summing up from your side before we hand over to Nick?
No, just it was a pleasure to be here with you guys, and I'd love to hear what you talk about when I'm not here there. And
Well, thank you so much, Michael. It's quite incredible for me to think that this work, which you embarked on 50 years ago and has remained a little bit kind of under the surface, perhaps, is now truly coming to the fore. And there's so many people that are interested and are starting to see its relevance and importance in a way which which just hasn't been appreciated historically. So I think that is a very wonderful thing. And I'm also struck by the idea that what we're exploring here is the complexity of human thinking and the complexity of the development of human thinking. And it's slightly unfortunate in a way that we're hung up on this word dialectical, because I'm starting to see dialectical actually as just the way humans think in many different varieties, where formal operations is really the exception that has been at the forefront of our educational systems in the West for so many years. But this has really been a mistake, in my view. Not that formal operations doesn't have its uses, because many of my clients have been extremely successful using it. But it's not the be all and end all by any means, as I'm sure we all believe. So thank you so much, Michael, for bringing this work into the world and giving us the opportunity to try to take it forward.
thank you, Nick. I have one more thing to say in response to what you said. Yes, that was Riegel's point, that this is natural thinking. Piaget happened to study what he did because of Kant's claim that there were certain kinds of thinking that were built into the human mind and therefore were universal. And that's why Piaget wanted to study the development of that presumed universality. You also reminded me, in talking about my work since 50 years ago, that Nick said most of the people in this group would be Europeans. And I want to thank all of Europe, because in the years after 1984, when my book was published, I would get royalty reports. And constantly there were more copies of my book sold in Europe and in Latin America than there were in the United States. And that was year after year after year. And then it was ESRAD, a European organization, that invited me to give that talk in 2016, that helped bring this group of people together. So I'm very grateful. And were it not for Europe, my work might be dead and buried by now. So thanks to all of you who are Europeans or Latin Americans.
You're welcome, Michael. We're here for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.